Theories of communication and culture, as you are all familiar, this instrument that we developed was grounded very strongly in the theories and writings of Edward T. Hall. So here, what I'd like to go over is how did Edward Hall conceptualize culture, and why is it that when we're talking about low-high context, we want to look at 4 different dimensions of communication context? How did Hall talk about those 4 different kinds of context? How do culture and communication inform one another? And then what are the roles of individual and situation? So usually when I'm teaching, I start out with this, very frequently used metaphor of culture as an iceberg, and I would sort of talk through this. I know you're all familiar with this, but I'll go on then to show you that one thing Hall did was define culture as communication and communication as culture. So Hall really viewed culture as a fundamental part of communication, as a fundamental part of what culture is. And so if we think about that, where would communication fit on this iceberg? Verbal communication, I personally would put under the visible part of culture. If it's written, obviously it's something you can see, so it's visible, but it's also something you can hear. So it's one of those parts of culture that's quite noticeable, whereas communication context is everything that conveys meaning in a communicated message beyond the literal meaning of the words. So where does that fit? Well, I think of that as being sort of, I like to call it just below the surface of the waterline. So it is part of communication. So it's part of culture that is something that we should be able to see and hear and notice. However, it's often not clear to us, or we don't pay attention to it. So it's kind of like, think when you're looking at something just under the surface of water and it's sort of blurry, and you can't quite make out what it is, I think of context as being like that. Like if you know what it is and you know what to look for, then you see and understand what it is. But if you don't, you might completely miss that it's even there. So Hall talked about context using the terminology low-high context. And he wrote that a high context communication is one in which most of the information is either in the physical context or internalized in the person, while very little is in the coded, explicit, transmitted part of the message. And a low context communication, of course, is just the opposite. So the interesting thing is that over the years, people have come to talk about Hall and low to high context, mostly in terms of this direct versus indirect. And if you read more deeply into Hall, you see that he actually talks in a very deep and thoughtful and articulate way about these other kinds of indirectness that are out there beyond just, whether someone says a message looking straight at you or looking to the side. So of course, Hall wrote that even if there's no words at all between interactants, there can still be a message being communicated through nonverbal behaviors, things like proximity to the other party and so on. So Hall used low-high context to characterize different cultures, different regions of the world that had distinct communication styles. And so low context cultures were primarily North American and Western European cultures. And Hall wrote about different high context cultures. He referred to East Asian cultures as high context. He wrote a lot about Japan. South American and Mediterranean cultures he wrote about as high context. He wrote a lot about the Native American cultures in the US, also Mexico. Also the Middle East and Africa are mentioned in Hall's works as high context cultures. So the thing that got us really interested in this work and developing a way to measure context was because Hall wrote about both East Asian and Latin American cultures as being high context and as cross-cultural. management scholars, as interculturalists, we immediately say, what? You know, how could it be that Japan and Brazil have similar communication styles? How could they both be high context? And so that was sort of the question that really motivated us 10 years ago to start looking at this, to take a deeper look at Hall and try to understand the different ways of that a communication style can be high context. So in particular, we drew from Hall's work 4 sources of context. So the first one is the one that everyone talks about, message context. So these are cues that convey implied and inferred meaning accompanying the verbal message. So it might be sort of dominance cues, where your eye gaze and things like that. Hall also wrote about information, nonverbal information contained in the nature of the relationship between the people communicating. So these are nonverbal cues related to what is said and how it is said based on the nature of the parties' relationship. So for example, you may be express your disagreement with a friend in a different way than you would express your disagreement with a boss or with someone at work. Or maybe you don't. Maybe you're someone who doesn't adjust what you say and how you say it, depending on the relationship. So spatial cues are cues within the physical environment that carry meaning. And in particular, the meaning is associated with engagement or attention, or things like affiliation cues. Speech rate is an example of that, and I'm going to give you more examples of all of these. And lastly, Hall wrote about time. Hall coined the term monochronic, polychronic, and time is a source of communication context because the way people in different regions of the world conceptualize time and move through time is related to how they attach meaning to time in communication. Right, so the idea of lateness here is a really good example. We don't see a lot of cultural variation in what it means to be late, if there even is something such as lateness. And so that's how time is a context that conveys information. Okay, so I'm going to give you examples of each of these, and then I'll pause for questions. So for message context, as I said, cues that convey implied and inferred meaning accompanying a verbal message. And a good example here, one of Hall's quotes, is describing an American's experience abroad and how surprised we are when someone says yes and it doesn't always mean yes, or when someone smiles and it doesn't always mean that they're pleased. So I won't read through all of the quotes here. You can do that on your own for sure. Let me know if you have questions later in the session or in your one-on-one session. Okay, so for relationship context, an example here from Hall's writing is he wrote about the French, who are very polite and meticulous about social forms. They expect precision in language and appropriate dress and behavior. Unlike Americans, they are not informal or casual. So that's sort of a distinction in how people perceive their relationships with others as influencing expectations in the and interpretation in the communication context. Okay, space context. Here Hall wrote, well, what most people think of here, and Hall has, did all of the original work on this idea of personal distance, interpersonal distance, but he wrote also about the physical boundary. So the way, for example, that someone can, claim a corner office, or in a negotiation, you invite someone to come to your office for the negotiation, and that can convey power. But this third bullet point here, Hall wrote, few people realize that space is perceived by all the senses, not by vision alone. Auditory space is perceived by the ears, thermal space by the skin, kinesthetic space by the muscles, and olfactory space by the nose. And so in Hall's writing, all of those ways that we are aware of and notice the communication space, so literally the physical space between ourselves and the person that we're talking with is the communication space. And so there's cultural variation in what that space means, whether it's conveying closeness and affiliation, or whether it's conveying something else. And so it's really a really rich, it's actually my favorite dimension. It's a really rich dimension that hasn't been looked at that carefully. And the last one is time context. And so I mentioned here, in a monochronic system, Hall wrote, the schedule may take priority above all else and be treated as sacred and unalterable. Whereas in polychronic time, simultaneous occurrence of many things and by a great involvement with people. So the way in which people interpret things like, interruptions or someone coming late to a meeting is going to vary by culture, because that context is a source of information. So before I go on to miscommunications, I just want to ask, are there any questions out there about sort of this basic overview of Hall, but possibly in more depth than you've thought about it before? Okay, so context, when I'm teaching this, once I've introduced context and gone into, made sure there's a good understanding of how it is more, it is broader and deeper than just direct, indirect. I like to talk about, well, what happens if people who have different styles of communication context come into encounter one another in the workplace? How is it a source of miscommunication? So it's just some simple examples. For message context, an example of miscommunication would be if someone looks away or has a feeling that's not spoken, but it impacts the meaning of a verbal message the other person might not understand. For relationship context, the nature of the relationship can determine what is said and what is not said. For space context, dramatic expression, standing close may be an amicable form of sharing communal space, but some people might perceive it as aggressive. And for time context, I like to give the example that, if arriving 20 minutes past a scheduled meeting is not considered late, or the culture the person comes from doesn't even have an equivalent concept to lateness, how can the behavior be rude or irresponsible, right? So people will tend to attribute the behavior to a characteristic of the individual. And then that's going to impact such things as misunderstanding, misattribution, conflict is more likely. These kinds of low-high context clashes are likely to lead to things like missed deadlines, poor performance, low trust, and interpersonal tensions. And so in our work, what we've done is we've defined a broad construct called context dependence, and define that as the degree to which one relies on and attends to information in the message, relationship, space, and time context surrounding a verbal message. And so the icEdge survey is basically measuring your context dependence. And it's divided in, the feedback is divided into those 4 separate dimensions of context. So each of the 4 sources of context do have some relationships to other cultural constructs that are out there. So I have this slide here. Again, I'm just going to kind of go through this quickly, and we can come back to it later if you have specific questions about that once we've looked more carefully at the measure. And then when I'm teaching, I also make sure at the beginning of a session, when I'm introducing the construct, introducing what it is, what is context dependence, I like to spend a little bit of time talking about things like level of analysis and stereotyping, and what is the purpose of understanding your own communication style, and understanding, for example, say you're doing a study abroad, a group of students who are going to go study abroad in China. What is the purpose of understanding sort of the average communication style of someone from China? So I talk about how, I love this one quote by Van Manen and Barley, that culture and communication are intricately intertwined. And whereas culture is a group level phenomenon, it is enacted and sustained at the individual level through communication and interaction between actors in specific social and organizational contexts, right? So that quote is really nice in showing why it is valuable to measure something like communication style at an individual level, and how that can then be looked at as well at the culture level and used to inform what you might expect or encounter at the culture level. Okay. So then I talk about how culture, the definition of culture, shared set of values and norms, enacted through communication, and talk about how there's different kinds of cultures, not only national culture. And then I give a couple of slides showing an example of how mean level cultural differences are useful in determining or predicting what you might encounter, but that there's always individual differences within a culture. And so you could have it on this slide, for example, you could have some Canadians here in the tail of the Canadian distribution who are, you know, more similar to the average person from the US. And then this is the example of how you might have some US Americans in the tail of the distribution that seem more similar to Canadians in level of directness. Okay, was there a question? No? Okay. And lastly, I talk about situational factors. So in enacting sort of the cultural prototype of the place where someone was from, the culture that they were socialized in as a young person, is going to depend somewhat on the situation. And there's lots of things we can talk about that sort of, you know, prime someone to communicate in their culturally normative fashion versus not. And so we have a discussion about that as well. And so all of this is summed up in this quote from the Cultural High Wire book, which I love, where Saphir and colleagues wrote that communication style allows us to get past stereotypes and to get to know others as the complex individuals or cultural composites that we are. So it's really sort of framing to your audience the way in which this work is going to actually help them not to stereotype, because that's often, as we know, some of the pushback you get. Okay, so that's the end of the introduction to the theory part, and I'd like to pause here and see if there's any questions at this point.
I think I have a quick question. This is Sherry talking. I know that there's some work that says, well, stereotyping is inevitable, and it's not so much not stereotyping as not having a particular valence toward the stereotype.
Okay.
So how do you handle something like if someone came back to you with that type of response?
Okay, yeah, so what when I'm teaching stereotype and prejudice and those sorts of things, I always do explain how the cognitive function, the necessity of stereotyping has to do with our cognitive limitations, and that we by nature put things into categories. It helps us manage the complexity and the chaos of all the stimuli that are coming at us day to day in our everyday lives. So categorizing people is a very natural thing, and when it can be useful. So I'll give people examples of useful stereotypes, right? So if you're at a if you're, you know, walking down the street and you see standing on the street corner maybe 6-year-old child all by themselves, you're going to assume, you know, okay, that's a child. They probably don't have a good idea of how to cross the street by themselves. They may be scared, they may be alone, and you're going to act on that categorization and help that child. So where stereotypes become dangerous is, one, the example you gave, where it is a stereotype of a negative characteristic that is put onto the entire all the individuals within that group of people. And then the other time it's dangerous is if, whether it's positive or negative, if it's applied to that entire group of people without going beyond to look at the individual and get to know the individual that you're interacting with. So once you get at that interpersonal level, you really have to have the sort of the openness and the flexibility to look and challenge the stereotype and see if it fits or not.